The year was 1670. London was a city still healing from the Great Fire that had torn through it just 4 years earlier. Amid the rebuilding and the raw scars of the past, another kind of conflict was simmering. It was a fight about what a person was allowed to believe and where they were allowed to say it. William Penn was a Quaker. This was a problem. The state religion was the Church of England, and the law, specifically the Conventicle Act, forbade religious assemblies of more than 5 people outside the official church. Penn, a charismatic and stubborn man, refused to comply. On August 14th, he went to the Quaker Meeting House on Gracechurch Street, only to find the doors barred by soldiers. Undeterred, he began to preach to the crowd that had gathered in the street. He was promptly arrested, along with another Quaker named William Meade. They were charged with unlawful and tumultuous assembly. The trial began on September 1st at the Old Bailey. The judges, particularly the Lord Mayor of London, Samuel Starling, were determined to get a conviction. They saw Penn and the Quakers as a threat to public order and the authority of the king and church. The evidence was presented. Penn and Meade had preached in the street. That was a fact. The judges instructed the jury to return a guilty verdict. This should have been a simple, open and shut case, but something unexpected happened. The jury, a group of 12 ordinary London merchants and shopkeepers, refused. Their foreman was a man named Edward Bushell. After deliberating, the jury returned a verdict. They found William Penn guilty of speaking in Gracechurch Street, but acquitted him of the charge of unlawful assembly. They found William Meade not guilty altogether. This enraged the court. The judges refused to accept the verdict. They told the jury they would not be dismissed until they returned a verdict the court would accept. They sent the jury back to deliberate again. The jury came back with the same verdict. The judges grew furious. Mayor Starling threatened Bushell, saying, "You shall be locked up without meat, drink, fire, and tobacco. You shall not think thus to abuse the court. We will have a verdict by the help of God, or you shall starve for it." The jury was locked away for the night. They had no food, no water, no fire, and not even a chamber pot. The next day they were brought back into court, weak and exhausted. They were asked again for their verdict. Again, they refused to convict Penn and Meade on the main charge. The court was in an uproar. The judges berated and threatened them. But the 12 men held firm. For 2 days and 2 nights, they were kept in those horrific conditions. Finally, on September 5th, they were brought before the court one last time. The clerk asked, "Is William Penn guilty of the matter whereof he stands indicted, or not guilty?" Edward Bushell, speaking for all of them, answered with a clear voice, "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. And Penn and Meade were free, but the judges were not finished. In an act of pure spite, the judge fined every member of the jury 40 marks and ordered them imprisoned until the fine was paid. And Edward Bushell and his fellow jurors were sent to Newgate Prison, one of the foulest places in London. This was supposed to be the end of it, a warning to any future jury that dared to defy the will of a judge. But Bushell refused to pay the fine. He stayed in prison, and with the help of Penn's father, his lawyers filed a writ of habeas corpus. This was a legal action to challenge his unlawful imprisonment. The case, which became known as Bushell's case, went to the Court of Common Pleas. 8 months later, in 1671, the Chief Justice delivered a landmark ruling. He declared that a jury could not be punished for its verdict. A judge might not agree with the jury, he might find their decision illogical, but he could not coerce them or penalize them for it. The jurors were set free. Their suffering in a cold, dark cell had established the independence of the jury. They had affirmed a principle that had its roots in a muddy field at Runnymede 456 years earlier. Clause 39 of the Magna Carta, which King John was forced to sign in 1215, established the right to a trial by one's peers, a cornerstone of the modern jury system. It stated that no free man could be punished except by the lawful judgment of his equals. The 12 men on that jury in 1670 were not legal scholars. They were brewers and bakers and drapers. But they understood that if the state could force a jury to convict someone against its conscience, then there was no real trial at all. There was only the illusion of justice. Their courage gave real teeth to that ancient promise, ensuring that the judgment of one's equals was a genuine shield against the power of the state, not just a rubber stamp. Number 10, you cannot be barred from leaving your country. The docks at Southampton in August of 1620 were a scene of controlled chaos. Two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, were preparing for a long and dangerous journey. The people gathered there were not typical colonists. They were not adventurers seeking gold or glory. They were families. They were religious dissenters, separatists who had broken away from the Church of England. They called themselves saints, though the world would come to know them as the Pilgrims. Their leader was a man named William Bradford. He was then about 30 years old, a serious and determined man who had spent his entire adult life trying to find a place where his community could worship freely. This was not their first attempt at escape. 13 years earlier, in 1607, their congregation in Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, had tried to flee England for Holland. Of King James, I was cracking down on religious dissent. His view was simple: no bishop, no king. He saw any challenge to the church as a challenge to his own authority. To leave England without official permission was illegal. Bradford and his fellow separatists had to operate in secret. They hired a ship captain to pick them up from a remote spot on the coast, but the captain betrayed them. He took their money and then turned them over to the authorities. They were arrested, paraded through the streets as a spectacle, and imprisoned for a month. Their possessions were seized. It was a humiliating and costly failure. The next year, in 1608, they tried again. This time, they found a Dutch captain who seemed more trustworthy. They arranged to meet on a desolate stretch of coast between Grimsby and Hull. The plan went wrong from the start. The women and children were sent ahead on a small barge, while the men marched overland to meet them. The barge got stuck in the mud, and the seas became rough. When the Dutch ship arrived, the captain began taking the men aboard. But before he could finish, he saw a large armed party approaching on horseback. It was the local militia sent to arrest them. The captain, fearing for his own ship and freedom, panicked. He weighed anchor and set sail for Holland, with only a handful of the men on board. The men left on the shore could only watch in horror as the ship disappeared, carrying their friends and leaving them to face arrest. The women and children stuck on the barge were captured. It was a disaster. The women and children were eventually released, having no homes to go to and becoming a burden on the local magistrates. Over the next few months, in small groups and through various means, the rest of the congregation managed to slip out of England and reunite in Amsterdam. They had finally escaped, but the memory of being hunted in their own country, of being treated as criminals simply for wanting to leave, stayed with them. Life in Holland was hard. They were foreigners in a strange land, forced to take low-paying jobs, but they were free to worship as they pleased. After about a decade, they began to worry their children were losing their English identity. They decided to make one more journey to a new world where they could build a society on their own terms. This is what brought William Bradford to the docks in Southampton in 1620. This time, they had permission, a patent from the Virginia Company, to settle in the New World. The right they were exercising, the right to leave their homeland, was something that had been fought for centuries earlier. Clause 42 of the Magna Carta addressed this directly. It stated, "In future it shall be lawful for any man to leave and return to our kingdom unharmed and without fear, by land or water, preserving his allegiance to us, except in time of war, for some short period, for the common benefit of the realm." This clause, like many in the Charter, was aimed at the arbitrary power of King John. He had a habit of preventing his barons from traveling abroad, essentially holding them hostage in England to ensure their good behavior. He used the denial of travel as a tool of political control. The barons saw this as a fundamental violation of liberty. The freedom to travel, to trade, to seek opportunities or refuge elsewhere was a right of a free man. A clause 42 was a radical idea for its time. It established a default position of freedom. A person was free to leave unless there was a specific, temporary, and public reason to prevent them, such as a time of war. Of course, this right was not always respected by subsequent kings. As the Pilgrims' own experience showed, the crown could and did try to control the movement of its subjects, especially those it considered troublemakers. But the principle had been established. It was written down. It was part of the Great Charter that was seen as the foundation of English liberty. When Bradford and the others boarded the Mayflower, they were not just fleeing persecution, they were asserting a right that had been formally recognized 4 centuries before. The journey itself was an ordeal. The Speedwell proved unseaworthy and had to be abandoned, crowding everyone onto the Mayflower. The voyage across the Atlantic took 66 brutal days. They faced fierce storms that cracked one of the main beams of the ship. Disease, a mix of scurvy and pneumonia, swept through the cramped quarters, but they endured. They were driven by a faith in their God and a belief in their right to build a new life. Their story is often remembered for the Mayflower Compact and the First Thanksgiving. But at its heart, it is also a story about the freedom of movement. It is the story of a people who refused to be confined by the borders of a nation that would not tolerate their beliefs. They believed they had a right to leave. This right, first articulated in 1215 to protect the travel plans of powerful barons, had evolved into a principle that gave hope to a small group of religious refugees. It allowed them to cross an ocean and found a colony that would in time become part of a new nation. A nation that would enshrine its own protections for liberty, building on the ancient foundations laid by a group of angry noblemen who insisted that even a king could not turn his own kingdom into a prison for his subjects. Number 9. The pint you drink in the loaf of bread you buy must be honest. Giles of Southwark was a baker. He lived in the early 14th century, a time when London was a teeming, filthy, and vibrant city. His bakery was a small, hot building, its walls perpetually covered in a fine layer of flour dust. The air inside always smelled of wood smoke and warm bread. For Giles, like for thousands of other craftsmen in the city, his livelihood depended on two things: his skill and his reputation. Have a baker who made good bread would have customers. A baker who was known to be a cheat would be ruined. The problem was that the definition of cheating was not always in his control. The price of bread was not set by the baker. It was regulated by a royal ordinance known as the Assize of Bread and Ale. This was one of the first laws in English history to deal with consumer protection. It linked the weight of a loaf of bread to the price of grain. When the price of wheat went up, a baker could not simply charge more for his standard loaf. Instead, the law required him to make the loaf smaller. A penny loaf had to have a specific weight, calculated by officials based on the current market price of a quarter of wheat. This system was meant to ensure a stable and fair food supply for the city's population, to prevent bakers from price gouging when grain was scarce. For a baker like Giles, this was a constant source of anxiety. He had to buy his flour and firewood at market prices, which could fluctuate wildly. But the size of the bread he could sell for a penny was fixed by law. If he made his loaves too large, he would lose money. If he made them too small, he would face the fury of the law. The punishments were severe. For a first offense, a baker could be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf of bread tied around his neck. It was a public shaming designed to destroy his reputation. For repeated offenses, he could be put in the pillory or even banished from the city. One morning, the Ale Connors, who also served as the city's market inspectors, arrived at Giles's shop. They were powerful and often feared men. They entered without ceremony, their eyes scanning the racks of cooling loaves. They selected a farthing loaf, the smallest size, and placed it on their official scales. Giles watched, his heart pounding. He knew he was an honest man. He had tried to follow the assize precisely, but ovens are not precise instruments. Dough can lose more or less water depending on the heat. A slight miscalculation could mean the difference between compliance and crime. The scale tipped. The loaf was underweight. Not by much, just a fraction of an ounce, but it was enough. The inspectors declared his bread false. His protests were useless. He was taken to the Guildhall to face the mayor's court. He was fined and warned. The shame was immense. His neighbors whispered. His customers looked at him with suspicion. To protect himself, he started doing what many other bakers did. He began giving a baker's dozen. When a customer bought 12 loaves, he would give them a 13th for free. This was not an act of generosity. It was a form of insurance, a way to make sure that the total weight of the bread sold was well over the legal requirement, protecting him from another accusation. This entire system of regulated, standardized commerce has its roots in the Magna Carta. In a world of local customs and the whims of powerful lords, trade could be a chaotic and unfair business. A lord might have his own preferred bushel measure, which could be larger when he was collecting taxes in grain and smaller when he was selling it. The lack of standards made honest trade difficult and opened the door to widespread fraud. The barons who confronted King John were not just concerned with high-minded legal principles. They were practical men They were landowners and businessmen. They wanted a predictable and fair environment in which to conduct their affairs. So they included Clause 35 in the charter. It reads, "There shall be standard measures of wine, ale, and corn throughout the kingdom, namely the London quarter, and a standard width of dyed cloth, russet, and haberject, namely 2 ells within the selvages. Weights are to be standardized similarly." And this clause was a demand for uniformity. It said that a gallon of ale in York should be the same as a gallon of ale in London. A bushel of wheat should be the same on a lord's manor as it is in the city market. It was a foundational step toward creating a single economic market with clear, transparent rules. This might seem like a mundane, technical detail compared to the grand principles of justice and liberty. But for a person like Giles the baker, or a weaver, or a merchant, it was everything. It was the difference between a fair system and a rigged one. It meant that the rules were known and applied to everyone. The government had a duty to ensure that the basic units of economic life were reliable. The ale Connors who tested Giles's bread were the direct descendants of this clause. The scales they used were supposed to be calibrated to a national standard, the London quarter, mentioned back in 1215. The struggle for honest measures did not end with the Magna Carta. It continued for centuries. But the charter established the principle. It recognized that for a society to function, for people to have trust in the marketplace, there had to be a common set of standards. The right you enjoy today when you buy a gallon of gas, a pound of coffee, or a pint of beer, the right to be confident that you are getting what you paid for, is a direct legacy of this practical, business-minded clause. It's a right that was fought for not just in a field with a king, but in thousands of medieval market stalls and bakeries by ordinary people who simply wanted a fair measure for their money. Number 8, a widow cannot be forced to marry and can inherit her property. Isabella of Gloucester was one of the wealthiest women in England. She was the sole heir to a vast earldom controlling huge swathes of land in the west of England and Wales. Her wealth made her a valuable prize. In 1189, when she was still a young woman, she was married to Prince John, the youngest son of King Henry II. It was a strategic marriage designed to secure John's power and fortune. For 10 years, they were husband and wife. But the marriage was a failure. They had no children, and they were, according to the church, too closely related. As John had grown tired of her, by 1199, he was king, and he wanted a new wife, a more politically advantageous one. He had the marriage annulled. Suddenly, Isabella's world was turned upside down. She was no longer a queen. King John, her former husband, was now her legal guardian. He controlled her lands, her castles, her wealth. She was a pawn in his political games. For years, she was kept in a state of limbo, sometimes under house arrest, while John reaped the profits from her estates. John was notorious for his treatment of aristocratic widows and heiresses. He saw them as a source of revenue. The right of a feudal lord, including the king, to control the marriage of a female ward was a long-standing tradition. A lord could essentially sell the right to marry a wealthy widow to the highest bidder. The man who bought this right would gain control of her lands and fortune for the rest of his life. For the woman, this meant she could be forced into a marriage she did not want, often to a man who was only interested in her money. If a widow wanted to remain single, she often had to pay the king an enormous fee for the privilege. And King John exploited this system ruthlessly. The royal records are filled with examples. The widow of a man named Henry of Cornhill had to pay the king £200, a massive sum, to be allowed to remain unmarried and to have custody of her own children. Another Alice, Countess of Warwick, had to pay a staggering £1,000 and 10 fine horses for the right not to be married except to her own liking. John was effectively blackmailing these women. Isabella of Gloucester experienced this firsthand. John first sold her wardship to Hubert de Burgh, one of his chief ministers. Then in 1214, with his political and financial troubles mounting, John needed to secure the loyalty of one of his most powerful barons, Geoffrey de Mondeville, the Earl of Essex. To do this, he offered him Isabella's hand in marriage. The price was astronomical. Mandeville had to promise to pay the king 20,000 marks, an impossible sum that was more than the entire annual income of the kingdom. It was a debt that would crush him, but the prize was Isabella and her earldom, Mandeville agreed. Isabella, who was then in her 40s, was forced to marry a man she barely knew, a man who had bought her from her ex-husband. Her story, and the stories of countless other women like her, was a major source of resentment among the baronage. You know, these were their mothers, their sisters, their daughters. The king's abuse of his feudal rights of wardship and marriage was not just a financial issue, it was a deeply personal one. It violated the honor and security of their families. When the barons finally rebelled and drew up their list of demands, this issue was near the top. They included two crucial clauses in the Magna Carta to address it. Clause 7 stated, at her husband's death, a widow shall have her marriage portion and inheritance at once, and without trouble she shall pay nothing for her dower, marriage portion, or any inheritance that she and her husband held on the day of his death. She may remain in her husband's house for 40 days after his death, and within this period her dower shall be assigned to her. This was a practical protection. It ensured that a widow was not left destitute and homeless immediately after her husband's death. It gave her breathing room and a legal right to her share of the property. Then came Clause 8, which was even more direct. No widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she wishes to remain without a husband, but she must give security that she will not marry without royal consent if she holds her lands of the crown, or without the consent of whatever other lord she may hold them of. This was revolutionary. For the first time, it was written down in the highest law of the land that a widow had the right to choose. She could not be forced into a marriage against her will. Okay, the second part was a compromise, acknowledging the Lord's interest in who controlled the land, but the core principle was established: a woman's consent was required. For Isabella of Gloucester, these changes came too late. Her new husband, Geoffrey de Mandeville, was killed in a tournament in 1216, not long after the Magna Carta was signed and then repudiated by the king. Once again, she was a widow, and once again her wardship and lands fell under the control of the king. But the principles laid down in the charter had taken root. Although the path to full property and personal rights for women would be long and difficult, the Magna Carta was the first major step. It recognized that women, at least women of the property-owning class, were not just assets to be traded. It gave them a legal identity and a set of rights that could not be arbitrarily ignored by even the most powerful man in the kingdom. The right of a woman to control her own property and to choose her own destiny, a right still fought for in many parts of the world today, had one of its first and most important expressions in the plight of women who lived under a predatory king. Number 7, the church is a separate power from the state. Stephen Langton was a scholar. He was an Englishman, but he had spent most of his adult life in Paris, where he was one of the most respected theologians at the university. He was a man of books and ideas, not a politician, but in 1205 his life changed forever. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the most powerful church position in England, had died. This set off a bitter struggle over who would be his successor. There were two main candidates, one favored by a group of monks at Canterbury and another favored by King John. Both sides appealed to the man who held the ultimate authority in the medieval church, Pope Innocent III. The Pope, one of the most powerful and politically astute popes in history, rejected both candidates. Instead, he proposed his own Stephen Langton. Langton was brilliant. He was known to be a man of integrity, and he was English. But he had spent years away from the country and had no loyalty to King John. In 1207, the Pope consecrated Langton as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. King John was furious. He saw this as a direct attack on his royal authority. For centuries, English kings had claimed the right to approve the appointment of their own bishops. There was a crucial power. Bishops were not just spiritual leaders. They were major landowners, wealthy administrators, and key advisors. A king needed bishops he could trust, men who would be loyal to him. John refused to allow Stephen Langton to enter England. He seized the lands and revenues of the See of Canterbury, punishing the monks who had gone to Rome. This began a confrontation that would last for more than 6 years. Pope Innocent III responded with the most powerful weapon in his spiritual arsenal. In 1208, he placed all of England under an interdict. This was a form of collective punishment. Across the kingdom, all church services were suspended. No masses could be celebrated. No marriages could be consecrated in a church. No burials could take place in consecrated ground. The church bells fell silent. For the ordinary person in the 13th century, this was a terrifying prospect. It meant living and dying without the sacraments of the church, risking eternal damnation. King John, however, did not back down. He retaliated by seizing church property across England. He confiscated the estates of bishops and monasteries, using the income to fund his government and his wars. It was a massive transfer of wealth from the church to the crown. Many bishops fled the country. The king seemed to be winning. He had the money, and the Pope's spiritual weapons seemed to be having little effect on his political power. In 1209, the Pope took the next step. He excommunicated King John. This meant that John was officially cast out of the church. He was declared to be outside the community of Christian believers. In theory, this meant his subjects were no longer bound by their oaths of loyalty to him. It was an open invitation for his barons to rebel and for foreign kings to invade. Still, John held on. But his political situation was deteriorating. He was facing threats from the King of France, and his relationship with his own barons was growing worse by the day. By 1213, John realized he could not fight both the Pope and his own people. He needed to make peace with the church. He surrendered in a stunning public act of humiliation. He agreed to all of the Pope's demands. He accepted Stephen Langton as archbishop. He agreed to compensate the church for all the money he had seized, and he went one step further. He formally surrendered his entire kingdom to the Pope, receiving it back as a papal fief. This meant he was now officially the Pope's vassal, and he had to pay an annual tribute to Rome. Stephen Langton was finally able to return to England. He arrived not just as an archbishop, but as a key figure in the political crisis that was now boiling over. He found a country on the brink of civil war. The barons were angry about the king's endless taxes, his arbitrary justice, and his military failures. The Langton, who had spent his academic career studying the Old Testament and the nature of kingship, believed that a king's power was not absolute. A king was appointed by God, but he had a duty to rule justly, to uphold the law, and to protect the rights of his subjects. He became a mediator between the king and the rebellious barons. He worked to channel their grievances into a written document, a Charter of Liberties. It is widely believed that he was one of the main architects of the Magna Carta. It is no accident that the very first clause of the Magna Carta deals with the church. In Clause 1 states first that we have granted to God, and by this present charter have confirmed for us and our heirs in perpetuity, that the English church shall be free and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired. It goes on to specifically mention the freedom of elections, the very issue that had started the conflict between John and the Pope. This clause was a declaration of independence for the church. It said that the church was a separate institution with its own rights and freedoms, and the king could not simply interfere in its affairs as he saw fit. This was the beginning of a long and complex struggle over the relationship between church and state, a principle that would later evolve into the idea of the separation of church and state. The conflict involving Stephen Langton established that there was a limit to the king's power. There was a moral and spiritual authority that stood apart from the state. The king could not control what people believed, and he could not control the institution that governed their spiritual lives. This idea that there should be a sphere of life protected from government interference is a cornerstone of modern freedom. It was fought for by a scholar archbishop who was forced into a political battle he never sought, a battle that helped create the most famous legal document in history. Number 6, the government cannot simply seize your property for its own use. Thomas of Kent was a farmer. He was not a lord or a knight, he was a freeman, which meant he owned his small plot of land and was not tied to it like a serf. His farm was his life. He worked it with his sons from the cold dawns of spring planting to the exhausting days of the autumn harvest. The farm provided everything for his family, the grain for their bread, the vegetables for their pot, the wool from their sheep for their clothes. What little they had left over they would take to the local market to sell, giving them the few coins they needed for salt, tools, or anything else they could not make themselves. His life was governed by the seasons and the weather, but there was another, more unpredictable force he had to deal with: the king's officials. The royal court in the 13th century was not stationary. King John was constantly on the move, traveling around the country with his vast household of knights, clerks, servants, and hangers-on. This mobile government needed to be fed and supplied. The system for doing this was called purveyance. It gave royal officials known as purveyors the right to seize goods and provisions for the king's use. They could take food, grain, livestock, wine, and even timber from the lands they passed through. They could also demand the use of horses and carts to transport these goods. In theory, this was not supposed to be outright confiscation. The purveyors were supposed to pay a fair price for what they took. But the reality was often very different. The prices they offered were frequently well below the market rate. Sometimes payment was deferred, with the farmer being given a wooden tally stick as a promise of future payment, a promise that was often broken. Sometimes there was no payment at all. For a powerful lord, this might be an annoyance. For a small farmer like Thomas, it could be a catastrophe. One summer, the king's court was traveling through Kent. A purveyor, a swaggering man with a royal emblem on his tunic, arrived at Thomas's farm. He and his men walked through the fields and into the barn as if they owned the place. They were there to acquire supplies for the king's table and stables. The purveyor pointed to Thomas's best ox, the one he relied on for plowing his fields. He claimed it for the king. He then went to the barn and demanded a large portion of the hay. Thomas had just spent weeks cutting and storing the hay his animals would need to survive the coming winter. Then he ordered Thomas to use his own cart and his remaining ox to transport the hay to the king's next stopping point, a journey that would take him away from his own urgent harvest work for several days. Thomas tried to argue. He explained that he needed the ox for the plowing, that his own livestock would starve without the hay. He asked for a fair price. The purveyor just laughed. He was acting in the king's name. Who was a simple farmer to question him? He offered a pittance far less than the hay and the ox were worth and handed Thomas a notched tally stick. Thomas knew it was unlikely he would ever see a real coin. He was left with no choice. He watched as his ox was led away and his winter fodder was loaded onto his own cart. He had been legally robbed by his own government. This kind of casual tyranny was happening all over England. It was a constant source of friction and deep-seated anger. It was not just about the financial loss, it was about the fundamental injustice of it. A man's property, the fruit of his own labor, was not secure. It could be taken at any time by an official of a distant and uncaring government. This grievance was not limited to the common farmer. The barons, too, had their goods and castles seized by the king for political reasons. The security of private property was an issue that united different classes of society against the king. When the barons drew up their list of demands, they made sure to address this abuse of power directly. Several clauses in the Magna Carta deal with the practice of purveyance. Clause 28 is the most direct: no constable or other royal official shall take corn or other movable goods from any man without immediate payment, unless the seller voluntarily offers postponement of this. This clause took direct aim at the problem of delayed or non-existent payment. It demanded cash on the spot. Other clauses reinforced this principle. Clause 30 stated, no sheriff, royal official, or other person shall take horses or carts for transport from any free man without his consent. Clause 31 added, neither we nor our officials will take wood for our castle or for any other purpose from any man without his consent. The key phrase in these clauses is without his consent. This was a radical shift. It meant that a property owner had a say. The government could not just take what it wanted. It had to negotiate. It had to act like a buyer in a market, not like a predator. These clauses represent one of the earliest legal protections of private property rights from government seizure. This principle is the ancestor of modern laws of eminent domain, which require the government to pay fair market value for any private property it takes for public use. It is a fundamental concept of a free society. What you own is yours, and its value cannot be arbitrarily extinguished by the state. For Thomas of Kent, watching his hay being carted away, this principle was not an abstract legal theory. It was about the right to keep what he had earned, the right to provide for his family, the right to be secure in his own home, and on his own land. The Magna Carta was his voice, a demand from the people that the king and his agents could not simply take what was not theirs. Number 5, the government cannot impose new taxes whenever it wants. And John Hampden was a wealthy gentleman from Buckinghamshire. He was a landowner, a member of Parliament, and a Puritan. He was known for being quiet, courteous, and principled. He was not a natural revolutionary, But in 1635, he received a tax bill that would set him on a path to confrontation with his king and ultimately to civil war. The tax was called ship money. It was an ancient tax, traditionally levied only on coastal towns during times of war to fund the Royal Navy. The idea was that these towns, which benefited most from naval protection, should pay for it. King Charles I, however, had a problem. He believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that his power came directly from God, and he was not accountable to Parliament. He had quarreled with Parliament over taxes and religion, and in 1629 he had dismissed it. He was determined to rule on his own without the constant arguments and demands from the House of Commons. But ruling without Parliament meant ruling without its consent to raise taxes. A king needed money to run the country, to pay for his court, his officials, and his army. Charles and his ministers had to find creative ways to raise revenue that did not require parliamentary approval. They resurrected old, forgotten laws and imposed new fees and fines, and in 1634 they revived the tax of ship money. At first they followed tradition and levied it only on the coast, but in 1635 they did something unprecedented. They extended the tax to the entire country, to inland counties like Buckinghamshire that had never paid it before. The justification was that the entire kingdom benefited from the protection of the navy, so the entire kingdom should pay. But everyone knew the real reason. It was a way for the king to levy a national tax without going to Parliament. If he could get away with this, he would have a source of income that would make him financially independent of Parliament forever. He would be an absolute monarch. Most people grumbled, but paid the tax. The amount was not huge, and challenging the king was a dangerous business. But John Hampden refused. The bill for his property was for just £1. It was not about the money. It was about the principle. He argued that the tax was illegal. He was not against paying for the defense of the realm. He was against the king imposing a tax on his own authority without the consent of the people as expressed through their representatives in Parliament. This, he believed, was the road to tyranny. His refusal to pay led to a major court case in 1637. Hampden was prosecuted by the state. The case was heard by a special court of 12 of the most senior judges in the land. It became a national spectacle. Hampden's lawyers argued that there was no war, no immediate emergency that would justify the king levying such a tax without Parliament. They reached back through centuries of English history and law. They cited the Magna Carta. Clause 12 of the 1215 Magna Carta was their foundation. As it stated, no scutage or aid shall be imposed in our kingdom unless by common council of our kingdom. Scutage and aid were specific types of feudal taxes that the king could demand from his barons. This clause was a direct response to King John's habit of making constant, arbitrary financial demands to fund his disastrous wars. The barons insisted that the king could not just invent new taxes. For major levies, he needed to get the agreement of the common council of our kingdom, which was a council of the leading barons and churchmen. This principle, that the executive branch of government cannot impose taxes without the consent of a representative body, was one of the most important and enduring legacies of the Magna Carta. Over the centuries, the common council of the kingdom evolved into Parliament. The idea that there should be no taxation without consent became a bedrock principle of English constitutional law. This was the principle John Hampden was fighting for. The king's lawyers argued that the king had a royal prerogative, a right to act for the good of the state in an emergency, and that the king alone was the judge of when an emergency existed. The case was a fundamental clash between two visions of government, one based on the rule of law and consent, the other on the absolute power of the monarch. The judges were under immense pressure from the king. In the end, they delivered a split verdict. 7 judges sided with the king, and 5 sided with Hampden. Hampden lost the case. He was ordered to pay the £1. Legally, it was a victory for the king, but politically, it was a disaster. The fact that 5 senior judges had sided with Hampden gave huge moral authority to his cause. The narrowness of the king's victory showed the country that the legality of his actions was questionable at best. John Hampden became a national hero. His stand inspired others. Ship money collections plummeted as more and more people refused to pay. The case hardened the opposition to the king's rule and exposed the deep constitutional divisions within the country. Just a few years later, in 1240, a desperate need for money to fight a war in Scotland forced Charles to recall Parliament. When Parliament met, one of its first acts was to declare ship money illegal and to denounce the verdict against Hampden. The confrontation that began with that small tax bill escalated into the English Civil War. John Hampden became a leading member of the parliamentary cause and was killed in battle in 1643. But the principle he defended, a principle first laid down in the Magna Carta, outlived him. It became a rallying cry for the American colonists a century later: no taxation without representation. It is a right you exercise every day. The power to tax, the most fundamental power of any government, rests not with a single ruler or official, but with the elected representatives of the people. Number 4, the government must follow its own rules. Sir Edward Coke was a man who loved the law. He was born in 1552 during the Tudor era and rose to become one of the most formidable legal figures in English history. He was brilliant, aggressive, and often difficult. He served as Speaker of the House of Commons, Attorney General, and eventually as Chief Justice of the King's Bench, the highest common law court in the land. In his time, he was known as the great champion of the common law, the system of law based on custom and judicial precedent, rather than on the whims of the ruler. And his favorite text, his ultimate authority, was the Magna Carta. When King James I came to the throne in 1603, a clash was inevitable. And James was a firm believer in the divine right of kings. He had written a book on the subject. He believed he was chosen by God and was the ultimate source of all law. He was the law. Coke believed the opposite. He believed the law was an ancient and independent power that was above everyone, including the king. The king was not above the law, he was under it. This was a direct challenge to the king's authority, and it led to a series of dramatic confrontations between the two men. One of the most famous occurred in 1607. King James had claimed that he had the right to personally sit as a judge and decide legal cases himself. And Coke was summoned to explain to the king why this was not possible. The meeting was tense. Coke explained that cases were not determined by natural reason, but by the artificial reason and judgment of law, which required years of study and experience to master. The king was insulted. He said, "I thought that the law was founded upon reason, and I and others have reason, as well as the judges." Coke famously replied, quoting a 13th century legal scholar, that the king in his own person cannot adjudge any case, but it ought to be determined and adjudged in some court of justice according to the law and custom of England. Well, James flew into a rage, declaring it was treason to say the king was under the law. According to Coke's own account, the king was so angry he was ready to strike him. Coke fell to the floor and begged for mercy. He had made his point, but he had also made a powerful enemy. The legal foundation for Coke's argument was Clause 39 of the Magna Carta. It stated, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." For Coke, the key phrase was "by the law of the land." In Latin, per legem terrae. He argued that this phrase meant that the government could not act against a person arbitrarily. It had to follow established legal procedures. There were rules, customs, and precedents that had to be respected. This was the essence of what would later be called due process of law. Coke used the Magna Carta as a weapon against the king's attempts to expand his power. He saw it not as an old dusty document, but as a living constitution, a guarantee of the fundamental rights of every Englishman. He reinterpreted its feudal clauses, which were originally intended to protect the barons from King John, and applied them to all subjects of the realm, protecting them from the government of King James. He was essentially arguing that every person had a right to a fair and predictable legal process. The government could not just make up the rules as it went along. His defiance eventually cost him his job. In 1616, King James, tired of Coke's constant challenges to his authority, had him dismissed as Chief Justice. But Coke was not silenced. He was elected to Parliament, where he became a leading critic of the king and his son Charles I. In 1628, he was the driving force behind the Petition of Right, a major constitutional document that was a direct response to King Charles's abuses of power, such as imprisoning people without trial and forcing citizens to house soldiers. The Petition of Right was a restatement and confirmation of the liberties Coke believed were guaranteed by the Magna Carta. It explicitly cited the Great Charter, declaring that no man should be imprisoned or have his property taken without being brought to answer by due process of law. The idea of due process is one of the most important legal concepts in the modern world. It is enshrined in the 5th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. It means that the government must respect all legal rights that are owed to a person. It ensures that legal proceedings are fair from the moment of arrest to the final verdict. It requires that laws be clear and not vague. It is the bedrock of a legal system that is based on rules, not on power. This right was not created in a vacuum. It was forged in the heat of political and legal battles. It was fought for by men like Edward Coke, who risked their careers and their freedom to insist that the law applied to everyone, from the poorest commoner to the king himself. He took an ancient phrase, the law of the land, and gave it a new and powerful meaning. He argued that it was a promise that the government would act fairly, that it would follow its own rules, and that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. Number 3, the punishment must fit the crime. Imagine you are a freeman in 13th century England. Let's call you Alfred. You live in a small village, and your most valuable possession is a milk cow. The cow provides milk for your children and allows you to make cheese to sell at the market. One day, you are accused of a minor offense. Perhaps you cut wood from the Lord's forest, or your pig wandered into a neighbor's garden and ate some vegetables. You are brought before the manorial court, which is presided over by the Lord's steward. You are found guilty. Now comes the punishment. You are to be amerced. An amercement was a fine, the most common punishment in medieval England. The size of the fine was not fixed. It was determined by the court. And here was the problem. A lord, if he was greedy or held a grudge against you, could impose a crippling fine. He can amerce you an amount that was far beyond your ability to pay. To pay the fine, you might have to sell your tools, your ox, or your only cow. The punishment would not just be a penalty. It would be a sentence to ruin. It could destroy your ability to work your land and provide for your family, pushing you into poverty and dependence. This was a system ripe for abuse. Fines were a major source of income for the king and for feudal lords, and there was a constant temptation to use them to extract as much money as possible from the population. This was a major concern for the authors of the Magna Carta. They saw how King John used his own courts to levy outrageous fines against his enemies and to fill his treasury. The practice of imposing excessive financial penalties was a tool of oppression, so they included a specific set of clauses to deal with this problem. Clause 20 of the Magna Carta reads, "For a trivial offense, a free man shall be fined only in proportion to the degree of his offense, and for a serious offense correspondingly, but not so heavily as to deprive him of his livelihood. In the same way, a merchant shall be spared his merchandise, and a villain the implements of his husbandry, if they fall upon the mercy of a royal court. None of these fines shall be imposed except by the assessment on oath of reputable men of the neighborhood." This clause is remarkable for its detail and its sense of fairness. It establishes the principle of proportionality. The punishment must fit the crime. A small offense should receive a small penalty. A serious offense should receive a serious one. This seems like common sense to us today, but in a world of arbitrary power, it was a radical idea. Even more remarkable is the second part of the clause. It says that no matter how serious the crime, the fine should not be so large as to destroy a person's ability to make a living. A freeman should be left with what he needs to survive. A merchant should be allowed to keep his stock in trade, his merchandise. And even a villain, a peasant who was not fully free, must be allowed to keep his implements of his husbandry, his plow, his cart, his oxen. This was a crucial protection. It recognized a person's right to work and to economic survival. The law could punish you, but it could not crush you. It set a limit on the power of the state to impoverish its citizens. And finally, the clause specified how the fine should be determined not by the judge or the lord alone, but by the assessment on oath of reputable men of the neighborhood. This is another reference to a jury-like body. Your neighbors, people who understood your circumstances, and the local context of the crime would be the ones to decide the appropriate level of the fine. This was a safeguard against a distant and uncaring authority imposing an unfair penalty. Clause 21 extended this protection to the barons themselves. Earls and barons shall be fined only by their equals, and in proportion to the gravity of their offense. Clause 22 applied it to the clergy. Everyone from the highest lord to the lowliest peasant was to be protected from excessive and ruinous fines. This principle of proportional justice is a cornerstone of modern legal systems. It is the reason we have sentencing guidelines for judges. It is the basis for the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibits excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishments. The idea that a punishment should not be arbitrary or vindictive, but should be calibrated to the specific offense comes directly from this 800-year-old text. For the farmer Alfred facing the loss of his cow, this clause would have been a shield. It would have meant that the steward could not simply invent a fine to ruin him. A jury of his neighbors would be called. They would know that the cow was essential to his survival. They would be required by the law of the land to set a fine that he could realistically pay, a fine that punished his offense without destroying his life. This was a profound legal innovation. It introduced a measure of humanity and economic realism into the justice system. It affirmed that the purpose of justice was to correct wrongdoing, not to annihilate the wrongdoer. Number 2, you cannot be imprisoned indefinitely without a trial. In the autumn of 1627, 5 knights were summoned to the King's Privy Council. Their names were Sir Thomas Darnell, Sir John Corbett, Sir Walter Earley, Sir John Heveningham, and Sir Edmund Hampton, a cousin of John Hampden of the ship money case. They were all wealthy, well-connected members of the gentry, and they had all committed the same offense. They had refused to pay a forced loan to King Charles I. The king, once again at odds with Parliament and desperate for money to fund his foreign policy, had resorted to a constitutionally dubious scheme. He did not ask for a tax, he demanded a loan. But it was a loan that no one expected to be repaid. It was a tax in all but name, imposed without the consent of Parliament. The 5 knights, like many others, saw this as an illegal act and refused to contribute. The king's response was swift and decisive. He had them arrested and thrown into the Fleet Prison in London. Crucially, they were not charged with any specific crime. The warrant for their arrest simply stated that they were being held per speciale mandatum domini regis, by the special command of the Lord King. This was the heart of the issue. The knights were being held indefinitely in prison without being told what law they had broken and without any prospect of a trial where they could defend themselves. They were prisoners of the king's personal will. To challenge their detention, their lawyers used an ancient legal tool known as the writ of habeas corpus. The term is Latin for "you shall have the body." A writ of habeas corpus is a court order demanding that a public official like a jailer deliver an imprisoned person to the court and show a valid reason for that person's detention. It is a fundamental check on the power of the executive to imprison people arbitrarily. If the government cannot show a lawful reason for holding a prisoner, the court can order the prisoners released. The case of the 5 knights, as it became known, was heard in the Court of King's Bench. Their lawyers argued that to be imprisoned without a stated cause was a violation of their fundamental rights as Englishmen. And the source of those rights, they argued, was the Magna Carta. They pointed directly to Clause 39, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. They argued that by the law of the land meant there had to be a legal process, a charge, a trial. Imprisonment by the king's special command was not the law of the land, it was the law of one man. The king's attorney general argued the opposite. He claimed that the king possessed a prerogative power to imprison people for reasons of state, matters of national security that could not be disclosed in open court. He argued that the king's command was, in itself, a sufficient cause. The court was essentially being asked to decide which was supreme, the liberty of the individual or the discretionary power of the king. The judges, under immense political pressure, sided with the king. They did not rule that the king's actions were legal, but they refused to grant the writ of habeas corpus and release the prisoners. They essentially accepted the government's argument that they could not question the king's special command. The 5 knights remained in prison. The verdict was a profound shock to the country. It suggested that any Englishman could be imprisoned indefinitely without hope of legal recourse, simply because the king or his ministers wished it. It struck at the very heart of the idea of English liberty. The public outcry and the anger in Parliament were immense. The case of the five knights became a rallying point for the opposition to King Charles's rule. The next year, in 1628, when Parliament was recalled, this issue was at the top of its agenda. Led by Sir Edward Coke, Parliament drafted the Petition of Right. The petition directly addressed the outcome of the five knights' case. It cited the Magna Carta and declared that no freeman, in any such manner as is before mentioned, be imprisoned or detained. It demanded that the king acknowledge that he had no power to imprison his subjects without due process of law. Under duress, needing money from Parliament, King Charles reluctantly gave his assent to the Petition of Right. The five knights were eventually released. The struggle was not over. The precise meaning and power of habeas corpus would be debated and fought over for decades to come. But the case of the five knights was a critical turning point. It had taken the abstract promise of the Magna Carta and tested it in a real-world crisis. It demonstrated that without a legal mechanism like habeas corpus to enforce it, the right against arbitrary imprisonment was just a piece of paper. The courage of those five men, who chose prison over paying an illegal tax, forced a national conversation about the limits of government power. The right of habeas corpus, often called the Great Writ, is one of the most important legal rights in the world. It is the ultimate safeguard against secret prisons and indefinite detention. It ensures that no one can simply disappear into the government's custody. The state must always be prepared to justify its actions before an independent court of law. This fundamental protection, which stands as a bulwark against tyranny, was secured in a London courtroom by five men who refused to be imprisoned on the whim of a king, armed only with a Latin phrase and a belief in a 400-year-old charter. Number one, the law is a power above any ruler. On the cold night of March 5th, 1770, a confrontation between a handful of British soldiers and a large, hostile crowd on King Street in Boston ended in bloodshed. The soldiers, pelted with snowballs, ice, and oyster shells, and threatened by the angry mob, opened fire. When the smoke cleared, 5 civilians lay dead or dying. The event was immediately dubbed the Boston Massacre. Its propaganda victory for the Patriots. Men like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere used it to whip up anti-British sentiment, portraying the soldiers as brutal murderers and the dead as martyrs for the cause of liberty. The 8 soldiers and their captain, Thomas Preston, were arrested and charged with murder. Finding a lawyer to defend them seemed impossible. The passions in Boston were running so high that any lawyer who took the case would face public condemnation, threats to his family, and the ruin of his career. One by one, lawyers refused. The soldiers were on the verge of being left without any legal defense at all, a situation that would almost certainly lead to their conviction and execution by a vengeful Boston jury. And then, a surprising figure stepped forward, John Adams. He was a 34-year-old lawyer from Braintree, and he was already a well-known patriot. He was a vocal critic of British policies like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. He believed deeply in the cause of American liberty. But he believed even more deeply in something else, the rule of law. He was asked to take the case. He knew the risks. He wrote in his diary that taking the case would bring upon him a clamor and popular suspicions and prejudices. But he accepted. Why? He later explained, counsel ought to be the very last thing that an accused person should want in a free country. He believed that every person, no matter how unpopular or how heinous the crime they were accused of, had a right to a fair trial. These facts, he argued, were stubborn things, and the law must be deaf to the clamors of the populace. Adams's defense of the soldiers was a masterclass in legal strategy and personal courage. He worked tirelessly to find witnesses and gather evidence. He managed to get the trial of Captain Preston separated from that of his men, and he successfully argued for the trial to be delayed for several months to allow passions to cool. In the courtroom, he faced a hostile jury and a city that wanted blood. His co-counsel was jeered in the street. But Adams was unyielding. He did not argue that the soldiers were heroes. He argued that they were scared men who had been pushed to the brink by a threatening mob and had fired in self-defense. During his closing argument, he made a powerful appeal not to emotion, but to the law itself. He reminded the jury of the importance of protecting innocence and the danger of basing a verdict on popular opinion. And in doing so, he drew upon the deepest traditions of English law, the very traditions he was fighting to preserve for America. He quoted from the Magna Carta. He spoke of the law of the land and the right to be judged by evidence and establish legal principles. He was arguing that the law was a system of protection that had to be applied to everyone equally, even to the hated redcoats. If the law could be set aside for them, it could be set aside for anyone. The law had to be a shield for the accused, not a sword for the powerful or the popular. His arguments were successful. The jury, made up of ordinary Massachusetts men, listened to the evidence. They set aside their personal feelings and political loyalties. Captain Preston was acquitted. 6 of the 8 soldiers were also acquitted. 2 were found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter, not murder. They were branded on the thumb, a common punishment at the time, and then released. For justice, in a city bang for vengeance, had been done. John Adams's defense of the British soldiers is one of the great acts of principled legal courage in history. It embodies the ultimate legacy of the Magna Carta. The Charter's greatest contribution was not any single clause, but the overarching principle that it established the rule of law. This is the idea that a nation should be governed by laws, not by the arbitrary will of individuals. It means that the law is supreme, and everyone, from the king to the commoner, from the government to the citizen, is subject to it. When King John placed his seal on the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215, he was, for the first time, formally acknowledging that his power was not absolute. He was agreeing to be bound by a written set of rules. He could no longer simply imprison his enemies, seize their property, or impose his will without reference to the law of the land. This was the seed from which constitutional government grew. It was a statement that the power of the state is limited and that individuals have rights that the state cannot violate. This was the principle that Sir Edward Coke championed against the Stuart kings. It was the principle that John Hampden defended when he refused to pay ship money. It was the principle that the 5 knights relied on when they demanded to know the cause of their imprisonment. And it was the principle that John Adams upheld in that Boston courtroom. He demonstrated that the rule of law was not just a tool to protect the people from the government, but also a discipline that the people must impose upon themselves, protecting the rights of the minority and the unpopular from the passions of the majority. Today, this principle is the foundation of every free and democratic society. It is expressed in written constitutions, in independent judiciaries, and in the guarantee of due process for every person. It is the belief that our governments are accountable, that our rights are secure, and that our legal system is based on a transparent and predictable set of rules. This idea, which seems so fundamental to us now, was once a radical and dangerous proposition. It was fought for over centuries in courtrooms, on battlefields, and in the consciences of individuals who were willing to risk everything to defend it. It is the final and most profound right that we inherit from that day in 1215, when a group of rebellious barons forced a reluctant king to agree that he too was under the law.